Brazil imported 40 times more slaves than the U.S. The massive disparity in slave imports between Brazil and the U.S. stems from distinct economic and agricultural factors. Brazil's vast agricultural lands and lucrative crops like coffee and sugar drove the demand for labor, with the Portuguese colonizers relying heavily on slave labor to work on plantations. In contrast, the U.S. had a more diverse economy and smaller agricultural sector, resulting in lower demand for slaves, ultimately leading to the significant disparity in slave imports between the two nations. The Brazilian sugar industry played a significant role in the massive influx of slaves to the country. Sugar production was a labor-intensive process that required a large workforce to plant, harvest, and process the sugarcane. The demand for sugar was high in Europe, and Brazilian planters sought to capitalize on this demand by establishing large-scale sugar plantations. As a result, the sugar industry became a primary driver of the transatlantic slave trade, with millions of enslaved Africans being forcibly brought to Brazil to work on these plantations. The backbreaking labor and harsh conditions on these plantations meant that the lifespan of a slave was relatively short, leading to a constant demand for new slaves to replace those who had died or become too ill to work. This created a vicious cycle of slavery and exploitation that persisted for centuries, with sugar production remaining a primary driver of the slave trade throughout this period. The scale of the sugar industry in Brazil was enormous, with thousands of plantations operating across the country, each requiring hundreds of slaves to function. This massive demand for slave labor helped to fuel the transatlantic slave trade, with Brazil becoming the largest recipient of enslaved Africans in the Americas. Despite Brazil receiving a significantly larger number of slaves during the Atlantic slave trade, the United States has a larger black population today. This may seem counterintuitive, given the massive influx of slaves into Brazil. However, several factors contributed to this demographic difference. In the U.S., the end of the Civil War and the subsequent emancipation of slaves led to a significant increase in the black population due to natural growth. In contrast, Brazil's black population growth was hindered by the fact that many African slaves were forced to intermarry with the indigenous population or with European settlers, leading to a more mixed racial identity. Additionally, the U.S. had stricter laws and social norms regarding racial segregation, which may have contributed to a stronger sense of black identity and community. As a result, the U.S. black population was able to maintain a distinct cultural heritage, whereas in Brazil, the African influence was often absorbed into the broader cultural landscape. This difference in racial identity and cultural heritage has had lasting impacts on the social and economic dynamics of both countries, with the U.S. having a more defined black population and Brazil having a more mixed racial identity. In conclusion, the disparity in slave imports between Brazil and the U.S. can be attributed to the unique economic and agricultural factors of each country. Brazil's massive sugar industry drove the demand for slave labor, resulting in the importation of millions of slaves. On the other hand, the U.S. had a more diverse economy and smaller agricultural sector, leading to a significantly lower number of slave imports. The demographic consequences of these differences are still evident today, with distinct racial identities and cultural heritages in each country. As we reflect on this dark period in history, it's essential to acknowledge the lasting impact of the Atlantic slave trade on modern society. The legacy of the slave trade continues to shape our world, from social inequalities to cultural exchange, and it's crucial that we understand and learn from this history to build a more equitable future. Ultimately, the story of the Atlantic slave trade serves as a reminder that the past is never truly past, but an ongoing part of our present.